want to thank everybody for coming this afternoon. My name is Fred Litwin.
Noted author Fred Litwin. And of course, Fred is also the author of I Was a Teenage JFK Conspiracy Freak, On the Trail of Delusion, and Oliver Stone's Film Flam, The Demagogue of Dealey Plaza.
Fred Litwin is here. He's a longtime author and certainly watcher of politics.
Joining us, Fred Litwin. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Well, welcome to another edition of On the Trail of Delusion, where I try to separate fact from fiction and try to offer something substantial, typically on the JFK assassination, more substantial than what you'll find on the internet, find on YouTube, and try to get away from some of the conspiracy nonsense that is all over the place. So I'm delighted today to have as my guest Mr. Phil Tinline, who is from the UK, who has just written this absolutely amazing book called Ghosts of Iron Mountain. Now, you may not know what Iron Mountain is, and you're going to find out, but this is a very important book. And let me tell you a bit about Phil before we get into this. So Phil is a freelance writer and documentarian. He's the author of The Death of Consensus, which was chosen as the Times as London's Politics Book of the Year. He's produced documentaries for the BBC, and he's written for The Guardian, the Daily Telegraph, the New Statesman, and a variety of other publications. And he's a graduate of Oxford University. And so welcome to On the Trail of Delusion.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So, Phil, if you just want to tell us a bit about how you got interested in this topic, what drove you to write this book?
Well, I had a much more grandiose idea for a book, which I was researching. What that was going to be about, I may still get to write it maybe one day. It was about the kind of moments of crisis that had produced various sort of shocks and fears that I thought, and I still think, make up the building blocks of conspiracy theory. So why do we think of crowds as infinitely manipulable sheeple? Well, I think it has something to do with the reaction on the right to the Paris Commune. Why do we have this idea of false consciousness? Partly the far less reaction in Germany to the failure of the Spartacist revolt in 1919. Anyway, I was looking at this kind of thing. I was looking particularly at the idea of another element of the kind of standard conspiracy theory movie we all have in our heads, as well as the sheeple and the plucky maverick. You obviously have to have the dark cabal. So where does this idea come from? So I was sitting one Saturday afternoon looking at political science books from the 1960s, as you do on a sunny day, looking for the phrase military industrial complex. And I found plenty, of course, but I also found 3 books that mentioned pretty much in immediate succession this thing called Report from Iron Mountain. I thought, what's this? It's particularly curious and intriguing because one seemed to suggest it was real, one seemed to suggest it was fake, and one wasn't sure. So I looked it up. There's a few paragraphs on Wikipedia, and I basically just wrote at the top of my notes, this is a really good story. It was the kind of thing I've been looking for a very long time, because I've been, making documentaries, as you said, writing in this sort of post-war territory for a long time. But you're always looking for a story that's got the sort of the compelling sort of narrative drive that you want to keep the reader going, but there's a strong enough structure you can hang some serious ideas on it. It's not just a larky anecdote. So I was very lucky to come across it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So why don't you tell us a bit about what is, Iron Mountain, the book, and, who wrote it and why did they write it?
Okay, so this goes back to the Vietnam War, and we need to go to a little office of a satire magazine called Monocle, nothing to do with the current, much smarter Monocle magazine, at the bottom of Fifth Avenue, just near Greenwich Village. And there's 3 young satirists, led by Vixen Navasky, later of The Nation magazine, sitting there looking at the papers. And at this point, the Vietnam War is just really beginning to hot up, but it looks briefly like there might be an outbreak of peace. And these 3 young guys are rather startled to see in the papers that the reaction on Wall Street to this has not been, as you might expect, joy. It's actually been basically fear. There's been a so-called peace scare, and so shares have dipped. And they think, firstly, this is a bit strange, and then pretty quickly, this gives us an idea, because they're always got their satirical eye looking for ideas. So they think, what if we came up with the story of the suppression of a top secret government report, which had been supposedly commissioned by Robert McNamara during the Kennedy administration to scope out with a team of top experts what would happen to America if permanent global peace broke out. The joke being it would destroy the economy and wreck society, and you'd have to have all sorts of horrific things to replace the beneficial effects of war. You might have to have sophisticated form of slavery to keep young men under control and maybe get them to play blood games. You might have to reintroduce eugenics, poison the rivers to unite people around the threat to the environment, and all these sort of, comically horrific things. But they publish it with the help of a very enterprising 60s publisher, the Dial Press, where the editor, by the way, is E.L. Doctorow, soon to be famous, as a novelist in his own right. They publish it as though it's real on their non-fiction list, and the Dial Press don't tell their sales staff that it's not real. So this is published, and of course the New York Times phones up the White House and says, is this real? And of course the White House have to say, well, we don't know, we better check. And there's a series of checks in the White House, in the Pentagon, and the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, where people kind of have to work out whether this extraordinary, outrageous document is real or not. And people begin to think, oh, this can't be real. And eventually the White House report, I've got the memo going up to President Johnson, says, no, we're pretty sure this is a hoax. But officials are still whispering to journalists, oh, this is kind of how people think in here. So, there's a kind of an ambiguity, which is exactly what they wanted. Because the thing that I've missed out from that story is they didn't just come up with the story of the suppression of this report. They commissioned a writer called Leonard Lewin, who was a bit older than Victor Nowacki and his comrades, who was a satirist as well. And he said, well, if I'm going to write the story of the suppression of this report, I need to write the actual report. That's why there's all this detail. And that's the book that's published as Report from Iron Mountain on the Possibility and Desirability of Peace. Anyway, Lewin says later, when he eventually confesses after the Pentagon Papers are published in 1972, I think, and he basically says reality has trumped satire, that what we were looking for is just this moment of uncertainty where people would ask themselves, could this possibly be true? Because once they're asking that question, they'll ask it about other things too. And so that's the first moment, and we can perhaps go on to talk about its later surprise ramifications, but that's where it comes from this moment at the end of the 60s, which is simultaneously very deeply political and still kind of larky.
So Leonard Lewin actually admitted back in the early days that it was a hoax.
Absolutely. He wrote an article in the New York Times Book Review, which I was very pleased to see reviewing my book kindly many years later. But yeah, I wrote a piece in the New York Times Book Review saying that it was a hoax, and this is why.
So there it is. He says that, and yet all of a sudden, this gets picked up by all sorts of people, including Fletcher Prouty.
Yeah.
I've written a lot about Fletcher Prouty, and I mean, what a character in so many ways. And I wrote about Iron Mountain, the fact that he was fooled by this, despite the fact it was quite openly a hoax.
Yes, and what's so extraordinary is that he knows that Lewin has said that he made it up, but his belief that this is the evidence of the dark cabal is so strong, the confirmation bias, I think, is so strong that he interprets Lewin saying that as basically, well, he has to say that it's a cover story, or he had to present it as a novel. His evidence, and this is the huge sort of inescapable irony of it, his evidence is that, having worked in the Pentagon, because as we should say, Prouty is a serious guy, works in, at least initially, he works in the Air Force, he works in the Pentagon, he's the liaison with the CIA, eventually retires around the time of the Kennedy assassination, and then becomes a conspiracy theorist later. But no, he is so kind of convinced that there is this dark cabal that he convinces himself that Lewin is saying this as a cover story, because partly he remembers, he says, how people used to talk in the Pentagon, and he says, well, this is exactly how these guys talk, so therefore it must be real. So the acuity and accuracy of Lewin's satire becomes evidence somehow that it's not.
And even I mean later on, I think Prouty would actually deny it. I never really believed it was real. I think he actually denied it later on, even though if you read his books, it's pretty clear he thought it was real, or really accepted it. Yeah,
and there's a point where he does an interview in 1981 at the National Press Club and so on. Yeah, no, he for a long time he certainly said that he thought it was real. It couldn't not be, because it spoke so clearly to what he'd heard in the Pentagon.
Yeah, I found a letter that he wrote to the IHR, the Willis Cardo's Holocaust Denial Review, where he basically said, I love your journal, and it's really, you're doing some very, very important work. And
Yeah, it's extreme. And because I don't, I mean, you tell me, you'll have a better view on this than me, but I don't think that he was an anti-Semite, at least front and center and overtly. I think he was just somebody who became very, very focused on trying to understand what this sort of strange sort of national security world that he'd been part of for a very long time really consisted of. And I think he was also, frankly, as a lot of, I think, conspiracy theorists have, he had a sort of curious respect for the pattern of authority. So the fact that the IHR was called the Institute for Historical Review rather than Holocaust Denial Grand Central, somehow was enough to convince him that it was proper, just as with the reports, the tone of it, the title of it had
yeah,
convinced him it was real too.
well, I'm amazed at how easy it is to convince him of stuff. But one thing I did find, I found a letter that he wrote. I found this at the archives. He wrote a letter, I think it was to Richard Sprague or something else, but he basically was talking about some of the arms, some of the control elements of the arms that the Pentagon was using. And remember, they had the AWACS, and it was controlled. It was a control system controlled from the ground or something. And he actually wrote a letter, and he says in the letter, he says, "What if the person on the ground is a Jewish sergeant?"
Oh,
And
really?
it was one of the only, because I think he was very careful about, if he was an anti-Semite, he was very careful about not being very overt about his anti-Semitism. And
Right.
this was the only time I think I caught him in something that was very, very overt. I couldn't believe this letter. It's on my website. It's
Right.
quite an
I'll have a
amazing
look.
letter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, whereas the people that he was talking to, Willis Carter, who you mentioned, who's the sort of eminence grise hovering behind the IHR and Spotlight magazine and all these other noontide press and so on and so on, is not a man who is afraid of putting his Jew hatred front and center. I mean, apparently, supposedly had 4 busts of Hitler in his office, so fairly unambiguous.
So before we get on to Willis Carta, which is a fascinating story,
Hmm.
perhaps you could tell us a bit about C. Wright Mills, some of the philosophy that sort of goes into the book, or the fact that Lewin draws a lot on C. Wright Mills for what's in the book. Maybe you could talk a bit about that.
For sure. I mean, I want to be careful about how much I can say for certain about how the direct lines of influence. They're often hard to prove, and I cannot prove, and I don't think we need to, but I can't prove that Lewin had read C. Wright Mills. I asked his children about it; they had no recollection of that. I think I spoke to Richard Lingerman, one of the one of the 3 young satirists who was still around as I was doing my interviews, and I think he said he had if I recall correctly, he had a vague recollection of looking at C. Wright Mills, but he's in his 90s, and asking someone to remember exactly what they read half a century ago is a tough call, right?
Yeah.
So I think what we can say though is that C. Wright Mills was the single figure who, more than anybody, kind of pioneered and encapsulated the ideas that the report certainly speaks to, and has certainly a big influence on the New Left, which was one of the constituencies which found the report quite compelling. So C. Wright Mills is an extraordinary guy. I mean, he's born in Texas and doesn't leave Texas until I think he's 23 years old. He's, by default, he's heading towards a career possibly in the military, as a kind of military academy and so on. But he's a very, I mean, I'm not in a position to say really, but my impression is he's a very Texan guy. He's a very big physical guy. He's not afraid to be violent. He's very proud of having kicked a racist in the face with both feet as a teenager. And he eventually, through his sort of rebelliousness and his insistence on personal autonomy and self-expression, really, he ends up in a very different place. He ends up as a sociologist at Columbia University. Now, most sociologists at Columbia and elsewhere in the 1950s are, for perfectly good reasons, very careful, very cautious, very empirical kind of
Right.
figures. Mills is a very different character. Mills is very focused on the idea of power. He writes a book called White Collar earlier in the 50s, and then he writes this book in the mid 1950s called The Power Elite, which is all about how a combination of the military and business and politicians in this new national security world, as a Cold War world created by the dropping of the atomic bomb in 1945, that this has become a very kind of tight centralized nexus of power. This cuts absolutely against the sort of much more gentle, pluralistic ideas of some of his colleagues who think American politics and democracy is pretty nicely balanced. And so this sense that there is this kind of not cabal, but there is this nexus at the heart of power. It's a very powerful one, particularly in terms of understanding what becomes the military-industrial complex. Indeed, that idea, the military-industrial complex, which was certainly known to Novaski and Lewin and so on, I think we can show was influenced by the power release. It's written, that speech is partly written by a very interesting figure, a guy called Malcolm Moose, who's a political journalist, a scientist, excuse me, he's a political scientist and a journalist who was Eisenhower's speechwriter and was reading Mills. We know he was reading Mills. And so you can see that idea appear in the mouth of President Eisenhower and the left, to the great excitement of the small American left in 1961. But anyway, you have this idea of the power elite, but Mills is also friends and colleagues with Richard Hofstadter. He does, of course, the Paranoid Style in American Politics speech, coincidentally the night before Kennedy's shot in Oxford. And so he's talking to Hofstadter and he's being very careful not to be a conspiracy theorist. But once you go through those shocks in the 60s, first, of course, the JFK assassination, and then the Gulf of Tonkin and the advent of the Vietnam War in its full horrific flower, you start to get people sliding across that line and thinking that actually the military industrial complex is not this perfectly, evidence-based analysis that Mills has talked about, but this, as you're very familiar with, from some of the conspiracy stuff, this numinous dark cabal hovering omnipotently and invisibly behind everything. And so that's where he fits in. But he's dead by early 1962. He dies of a heart attack. So, he doesn't even see the Cuban Missile Crisis, So he's a kind of forefather. I use him at the beginning of the book to try and set up some of the ground so that when I tell the story of the report, it's not just a kind of a quirky anecdote. It sits in a political frame.
So Iron Mountain, I mean, these were leftists who really were responsible for Iron Mountain. But what were they trying to accomplish? What were they hoping to accomplish with this book?
Well, what they were hoping to accomplish, as I say, as Lewin explains in his sort of confessional article in 1972. I mean, it's more wry than fraught. But what he's trying to achieve is a moment of uncertainty in people's minds where they would ask themselves if this could possibly be true. And he goes to great lengths to write it in really kind of convincingly dry Herman Kahn think tank prose. There's a whole bunch of footnotes, almost all of which are to real documents. He sweated blood over this thing. That by doing so, he can make you think, if this is possibly real, what else do I need to question about the output of the military industrial complex, of the Pentagon, of the Johnson administration? So he's trying to get a moment of what you might call defamiliarization. It's trying to kind of stop the slow progress further and further into the sort of depths of the Vietnam War and indeed also into the nuclear deterrence as well, and try and get people to just step back and ask themselves, hang on, could this actually be mad?
So I understand the book from their particular viewpoint of how they could write that and think that that there's a lot of stuff that they believe in. But how did this book get to be sort of so important on the right?
Well, there's a long period where it's more or less forgotten. Part of the thing that they're satirizing is the way that it appears, at least, that the Johnson administration is fighting war partly to sort of burn off excess surplus capital because America's economy is going gangbusters for year after year after year through the 50s and 60s. Now, you jump forward not very long after 1967, and having too much, money, having the government having too much money, it sounds like a pretty good problem to have. Once you've gone through, the bloodshed and horrors of 1968, 69, the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, and the massacre of My Lai, and the news of that breaking, then the massacre at Kent State, the killing of Fred Hampton, the Black Panthers, the Weather Underground, this whole kind of, rupture in American life, which follows very quickly after this, then into the world of Watergate, then into the world of stagflation and the energy crisis. All of this seems like a very good problem to have. So the idea that this satire is something that's still current sort of fades away. And by 1980, it's gone out of print. Lewin tries to get it republished in the 80s. J.K. Galbraith, who'd also been involved, is ready to help, but publishers are not interested. This is not a relic from the past. But then in 1990, he gets told by two different acquaintances that actually it has been republished. It's just as we've been discussing, it's been republished by basically fascists who think it's real. Now, the reason for that is significantly down to Fletcher Prouty. He had discovered it. He thought that it was real, and he was ready to pass it on to these guys. It seems like there was you can see a tiny bit of interest before this. I think there's a proto militia type group in Arkansas that contacts Lewin in the late 80s. But it seems like it's the end of the Cold War that does this. Now, at one level, this makes no sense at all, because if this committee is all about how we must never have peace, it seems a bit of a leap to suggest that the end of the Cold War is contrived by the same people, right? That doesn't matter in Pruti's head at all, because what he's interested in fundamentally, I think, this is the best kind of coherence I can find in it, is in evidence of this dark cabal. And it kind of doesn't matter whether they're pro-peace or anti-peace. The point is that they're there. And
Right.
when you have this surprising, jarring, almost shock rupture at the end of the Cold War, where suddenly the Soviet Union becomes an American ally after 40 years of the direct opposite. Saddam Hussein, in a smaller scale way, goes from being an ally to being an enemy. If you're of a conspiracist mindset like Prutti is, you make sense of it, on the basis that this is all pre-planned. And he has a complicated theory about David Rockefeller, which we don't need to get into. But that's basically the spur, I think, is 1989. There's a guy at the Noontide Press who contacts Prutti, that at least it looks like that from the letters. It's not absolutely certain. It's an ambiguity. But anyway, Prutti sends him a copy of the book. And because products of the American government are non-copyright, they're public domain, they think, well, okay, we can just publish this. They literally tear off the cover, photocopy it, print it, put a new copy on it, a new cover on it, which says, is this brilliant satire or new protocols, rather giving away their slant on these things. And it's republished. And that's when Lewin finds out about it, because they're advertising in Spotlight magazine, and he has to spend 4 years trying to get them to stop.
So this is where it comes out, and this is where Mark Lane comes into the picture. And I've written a lot about Mark Lane,
Right?
And so
Right.
there he is in the middle of this sort of, I guess, defending the publication of Iron Mountain by Willis Cardo's group.
Yes, well, so Lane and also the very brave black comedian civil rights campaigner Dick Gregory are the two guys who, in a way, literally embody the political shift we're talking about. They go from being, left wing, in Lane's case at least, sort of liberal left, campaigners in the 1960s, and effectively, partly at least, through the vector of JFK conspiracy theory, slide. I mean, I'm not saying that Gregory actually becomes right wing, but he's certainly in with these people. Lane, I think, effectively does, to all intents and purposes. Through the course of the 1970s, he's involved with Jim Jones, he's involved with Martin Luther King conspiracy theory and all sorts. He, in due time, becomes the lawyer for Willis Carto's very far-right group. His office is in the same building, just behind the Library of Congress. And so when the lawyers for Leonard Lewin start writing to these people, basically saying, cease and desist, this is not your property, you're not to publish it, the first lawyer to emerge and to write back is none other than, 60s liberal hero Mark Lane, which is, I think, as I say, a great embodiment of this weird slippage.
And in fact, I think it was Chip Burlett who wrote an article about Fletcher Prouty for the Progressive, saying this guy is Fletcher Prouty was a conspiracy theorist of the right, so to speak.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think Burlett's also pointed out that there is an article, I haven't read it, I will confess, but the John Birch Society was sort of fastening on to JFK conspiracy theory pretty much at the end of the 60s. It has quite a long sort of history, because, and this is again where Mills is interesting, I think, because I think, I don't want to say that the left and right are precisely equivalent. You can get very sort of facile on that very quickly. But I do think it is fair to say that that sort of centralized nexus of power that Mills describes is something that to sort of maverick leftists like him is very alienating and very much something to be treated with suspicion and wariness. There is a very similar, or at least analogous, feeling on the right that the centralization of power in Washington is not what the Republic was founded to be. The whole states' rights thing is very much against that. The whole idea of the freedom of the businessman is very much against that, and frankly, the freedom to be racist is against that. You obviously, through all those battles in the early 60s, you have this strange thing where the federal government is siding with the most disempowered people in the country against the state governments in places like Alabama and Mississippi and Arkansas. And so you have this curious kind of triangulation. But no, I think there is something logical about it. I mean, it's not a view that I share at all, but there is something logical about the way that centralized power looks pretty scary to both the right and the left.
Yeah, and of course you see it right now in the JFK assassination, where you have the right is going on about the deep state killed Kennedy, and in fact they'll even tell you that the deep state killed Robert Kennedy, and so you've got people like Jefferson Morley going on Steve Bannon's show, and they're in complete agreement about a whole variety of things.
Yeah, and it extends beyond conspiracy theory as well. If you look at, I don't know if you've read Kash Patel's noted volume, Government Gangsters, but that talks about, the FBI bugging of Martin Luther King in outraged terms.
Yep.
That sense to say from the right as well as from the left that the state, it's not based on nothing. The state did do some pretty tough stuff bad stuff in the 60s and 70s. But yeah, exactly. And I think it is very, very interesting the way that the sort of Trumpian right has embraced conspiracy theory. I wrote a piece a couple of years ago after the back of my trip to Dallas for my research for the book. Talked to a young journalist, Michael Williams, who reported on extraordinary events that had taken place literally on the grassy knoll, where people were expecting Kennedy to come back, or possibly John F. Kennedy Jr. to come back, or maybe Trump actually was John F. Kennedy Jr. And there's a woman who was dressed in sort of Captain America costume who was there, who I believe was also present at Jan 6 in the Capitol. So there's a very strong read across. It's rather striking.
Yeah. I was in Daily Plaza a couple of years ago, and I was talking to some of the QAnon people on the grassy knoll, and it was very, very weird and strange, to see them there. I mean, what a collection of people on the grassy knoll. I'm fascinated by Willis Carto and his stuff, and so where does it go from there? I mean, he republishes it and embraces Iron Mountain, and then where does it go from there?
Well, so there's a couple of different places it goes. One place is a movie that I believe you may be familiar with, Oliver Stone's JFK.
Right,
Pruitt is the central figure in I would argue is the central scene in the movie, the scene where Donald Sutherland, absolutely brilliant performance and a brilliant piece of montaging at the editing level by Oliver Stone, explains not just the how, Mr. Garrison, but the why. Why did Kennedy have to be killed? And its climax is basically not verbatim, but is pretty close to articles that Stone had seen by Pruitt in the mid-1980s explaining the Kennedy assassination through Report from Iron Mountain, this whole idea that war is the basic social system. The organizing principle of society, Mr. Garrison, is for war, and that's why the president has to be killed, because the Vietnam War is necessary to the military-industrial complex and to the CIA, so that feeds directly into the movie. Now, that is not to say, I should stress, that makes the film a far-right film. It is not a far-right film. It is a conspiracist film, and as much as anything, it's of the left. But it's certainly the report is certainly present there, and Pruitt was somebody that Stone sort of triumphantly, almost revealed, not quite out from under a cloth, but on a day at I think the National Press Club on C-SPAN, not long afterwards, amid all the hullabaloo about the film and its use of evidence and so on. But that's not the only place it goes. It also finds its way into the militia movement. This comes out, which is obviously developing around this time, and it comes out after a journalist who I spoke to, Wall Street Journal journalist, called Robert Tomshow, who was based in Dallas, went up to Oklahoma after the bombing of Oklahoma, the Murrah building in Oklahoma City on April 19th, 1995, and he starts asking around, and he goes out to see a couple of militia guys in the woods in Eufaula in the east of the state, and they say, have you read Report from Iron Mountain? Have you read Report from Iron Mountain? This is the explanation. So, and not the explanation for the bombing, I should say, but the explanation for our deep, profound suspicion and hostility towards Washington, to the point of being ready to fight to defend ourselves against the onslaught of the New World Order and the One World Government, which they're expecting any day. So it becomes one of the founding texts of certainly strong elements in the militia movement, but there's a whole other, and I could go on all day about this, so I shall try and be succinct, but there's a whole other Hoax, which is written, which is partly inspired by a report from Iron Mountain, called Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, which is proselytized by Milton William Cooper, one of the great sort of gurus of conspiracy theory in the 80s and 90s. And he publishes this book he publishes both extracts from Iron Mountain and the whole of Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, which is a supposed sort of manual for the elite to manipulate the sheeple, in his book Behold a Pale Horse, which I understand is the most shoplifted book in America. Also has a big influence on the X-Files. It influences rappers. There's even a rapper who calls himself William Cooper. You can see traces of it in QAnon, and so on and so on. It's sort of, what happens is it sort of ramifies and dilutes and spreads through the culture, and you can see signs of it today.
Yeah. By the way, just on going back to Oliver Stone, I have a memo that was. I mean, there was a brouhaha about Fletcher Prouty and his association with Willis Carto back when the movie came out, but I have a memo that I got at Baylor University from Jane Rusconi, who is Oliver Stone's research person, saying we have a problem here with Fletcher and his association with Willis Carto, and the fact that this anti-Semitism is real. And I've closed this article from the Guardian, and we've got to deal with this. This is a big problem. And I've quoted the memo. I have not published the actual memo because I'm worried about copyright, because it's an Oliver Stone memo. But there it was from his own research assistant saying we have a big problem here with Fletcher.
Yeah, well, exactly, and you had this extraordinary part of that whole story with Harold
Weisberg, yes.
And you have this extraordinary thing where one of the founders, really, of JFK conspiracism in the 1960s, a guy who, like quite a few of those people, had been a sort of persecuted leftist in the 1950s, and so very suspicious of, of the centralized state. This guy, Harold Weisberg, who is a very prolific conspiracist, publishes lots of books and writes more that weren't published, sees what's going on and is aghast at it. I mean, he's one of the people whose archive I drew on in the book, and he as an absolutely paid up conspiracist, still with an eye on evidence, however much he may have been misreading it, is aghast at what Stone is doing. So I think, the combination of conspiracy theories, in a sort of omni theory in the film, did upset people who were much closer to those beliefs than you or I are.
Yeah, in fact, Harold Weisberg, I published on my website a couple of massive letters he wrote to Oliver Stone about Garrison and his involvement with the whole investigation, et cetera, et cetera. And he actually, Weisberg wanted to write a book with George Lardner, who is a Washington Post journalist. I actually have their outline for a book that they write about Garrison and Oliver Stone. But of course, Weisberg was hard to get along with, and so they, as soon as they agreed on the outline, they started fighting. And and Lardner said, I can't work with you. We just can't, unfortunately, do it.
Right. It's because didn't Weisberg effectively leaked the script that he got hold of?
Yeah, he leaked the script to Lardner, and then of course Stone was all upset. Oh my God, you're criticizing the movie before it even comes out. I mean, this is just how insane, And
yes, I mean, which at one level I can understand, but Weisberg's papers were very useful because one of the people who contacts Lewin and says, you need to know that your book is being advertised by basically fascists, is a guy called Lud Ahrens, who has a kind of exchange with Weisberg, and it's back to the whole JFK thing about supposedly these various people who knew something about the assassination all mysteriously die, and it can't be a coincidence, and it's what ends up as the parallax view effectively. Right. And Weisberg is saying no, she really did just die. She just had a heart attack or whatever. She wasn't sort of taken out. So no, Ahrens was I think more conspiracist than Weisberg. The gradations are rather striking.
Absolutely. So, you talked about Bill Cooper. I mean, he's a very interesting character, and can you tell us a bit more about him in his book?
Behold a Pale Horse.
Yeah, so that book is, I guess you can buy it secondhand or whatever. There's multiple editions of that book. It's sort of a collection of a variety of articles and stuff.
Yes, I mean, including, horrifically, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, where he says, when it says Jews, it means Illuminati, which doesn't really make it okay, publishing the Protocols at all, obviously. But no, Cooper is an interesting figure. I think there's actually a rhyme with Prouty in that, they're different ages, but, Prouty is a veteran of the Second World War, And Cooper is a veteran of the Vietnam War. He was actually sailing a boat not far from the Gulf of Tonkin, not at the time of the incident, but, he then works for an admiral in intelligence, and he starts seeing a kind of, he gets real cognitive dissonance from seeing, Nixon saying one thing and what the papers he's seeing are saying something else. But he's also a guy who he'd grown up on military bases. I think he'd had a pretty tough time with his dad. And his dad was a particularly loving father. And he had become, once he leaves the military, particularly, he became an alcoholic. It sounds like he was pretty violent himself. I don't know the detail of that, but there's a great book by, I think, Mark Jacobson on Cooper called Pale Horse Rider, which has much more on it. Anyway, Cooper is somebody who is, I think, like Prouty, trying to make sense of their time in the national security state and trying to make sense of what that national security state is in toto. But he has again, rather like Prouty, he has a rather sort of self-creating relationship with the truth, let's say. So he will talk about how he was on a military base in, I think, Texas at the time of the Kennedy assassination and saw the assassination on TV and was really shocked. Well, the assassination itself wasn't on TV until the Zapruder film was on TV 12 years later, right? Obviously, you have Cronkite on his phone saying what's happened, but the footage was not. So, the sense of the sort of the convenient story just taking precedence over the messy truth is a big part of his thinking. The other thing about him, though, is that he was a big promoter of UFO theories until he decided that actually that was all a ruse by the state to pull the wool over the eyes of the sheeple. And so he started, and I think possibly he may have got that from looking at Report from Iron Mountain, which, jokingly suggests UFO scares as a way to unite people in the absence of war. So that, I think, if I recall correctly, that's one of the bits of Iron Mountain he puts in his report. So he's a very problematic guy. I mean, he ends up dying in a shootout with, I think, federal marshals over his refusal to pay his taxes. And he's sort of assaulted a local doctor in Arizona. He has a sort of little house on top of a hill in a place called Eager, and he broadcasts this extraordinary radio show called The Hour of the Time, which starts with the sound of a military clampdown, dogs barking, children screaming and marching and so on. He lived very much in the world of imminent tyranny the whole time.
I think Cooper believed that Greer, the Secret Service agent, shot JFK. He had that belief from watching the Zapruder film. I mean, it was really bizarre belief.
Yeah, he had. I think it was an alien had sort of shot Kennedy or something. I mean, yes. I mean, it's sort of.
And I'll tell you a funny story about UFOs. I mean, you have Sylvia Marr, who was one of the major critics of the Warren Report, back in early 1965. She had a meeting in her apartment in New York of other people who were interested in criticizing the Warren Report. And so there are like 10, 12 people, and Edward J. Epstein comes to that meeting, and he's walking around her apartment, and he looks at her bookshelf, and there's all these books on UFOs. Wow. And his heart just sunk when he realized, oh my God, who am I really dealing with here?
Well, right. And I think he is a really impressive and interesting figure in this story because, he, along with Lane, is one of the two people who first goes to print, right? They're arguably pretty much the two people who launch, book-length JFK conspiracy theory. But I think Epstein takes the idea of theory a little bit more seriously than most so-called conspiracy theorists, right? And that he keeps testing it, and he eventually, as far as I can tell, comes to the conclusion that actually, it doesn't really hold up after spending an enormous amount of time on it, to the rather sort of the consternation of some of the people concerned. And it's striking that Epstein is one of the people who calls out Stone's use of Report from Iron Mountain at the time of the film coming out.
The organizing principle of any society, Mr. Garrison, is for war. The authority of the state over its people resides in its war powers. And Kennedy wanted to end the Cold War in his second term.
This sort of panel discussion at Town Hall, just off Broadway, this theatre, which is chaired by Victor Navasky, who'd come up with Report from Iron Mountain, which has Epstein on stage, has Christopher Hitchens on stage, has Stone himself, has Norman Mailer, has Nora Ephron, and so on. where they're discussing, fact fiction and JFK, and they don't actually talk about Report from Iron Mountain, but so many of the people on the panel sort of know something about it that it's sort of hovering around it. And Epstein again is the person there who's saying, look, there's no harm in fiction. He says The Quiet American by Graham Greene in many respects told more truth about the Vietnam War than many government press releases. But we have to hang on to the border between fiction and evidence.
By the way, at that meeting, at that town hall, sitting next to Stone or right behind him was Jane Rusconi, who was his research person. And every time he was asked something about the specifics in the film, he would defer to her. He really didn't know the specifics, so she would sort of answer the question. And I've always been amazed. He really doesn't know the case that well. He relies on other people.
Well, that's always very striking to me, because I spent a long time as a producer for the BBC, sometimes doing more of the work on a program, shall we say, than the presenter, who then was front and center and took all the credit. So I rather kind of empathize with Jane Rusconi in that situation.
So Bill Cooper embraces it, and this is the part of the story which is very important, because, as I keep on saying, it's not just people in their basement believing in a silly conspiracy theory, Bigfoot or something, and it's harmless and doesn't hurt anybody. In fact, sometimes conspiracy theories have real life ramifications and do hurt people. Yeah,
exactly. And I think it's because it can be such a powerful explanation of what has gone wrong. What we know from political science, that one of the main things that makes people more susceptible, and obviously people's characters are various and doesn't always go the same way, but one of the things that makes people more susceptible to conspiracy theory is a shock defeat. Now, often shock defeats happen to the left or to the right, but we've seen more recently, I would argue, both in America and with Brexit in Britain, that certain people in the very dead political centre, when experiencing a shock defeat, will attribute the whole thing to the Russians, in a way that they might not have expected themselves to have done. So no, I think that is really important. And when you marry that with somebody like Cooper, who is capable with great passion and authority of assert, and great sort of constitutional sort of density of reference, to assert that this is fundamentally a kind of betrayal of the Republic, and to call on order, which we don't do here in quite the same way. Cromwell's a bit further back. Call on all the sort of the spirit of 1776 and the need for ordinary people to take up arms to defend the country against tyranny. I mean, that's a pretty fiery place to get to psychologically. You can definitely see that in his reaction to Oklahoma City, and also to Waco. Waco was a huge part of that. In the early 90s, and what happened at Waco was pretty suboptimal, but the reading of that by people like Cooper was really incendiary.
Yeah, and so this book, the Iron Mountain, has just been embraced by so many people. I mean, it's unbelievable that people are still writing about and accepting Iron Mountain to support their theories.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was struck by was, relatively speaking, it doesn't seem to play much of a role around the Iraq War. I had a good old dig, and I couldn't see very much. I mean, there may be things that were online at the time that sort of, the websites have died or whatever. But without the evidence, I can't assert that was the case. But you can see it come back, and you can see silent weapons come back after another series of shocks. You have the combination at the end of the noughties, as we have to call them. You have the sort of the slow burn shock of the Iraq War disaster, and the kind of the deep damage that does to people's sense of the kind of reliability of the government, and the kind of goodwill of the of defense companies, plus the physical damage to a lot of people, as a result of service. But then you have the crash in 2008, which wrecks a lot of people's lives. It upends their economic life. And then you have Obama, a black president, And so this is another series of shocks. And you see round about that time, David Newitt, the journalist who's done so much work on this, says the militia movement basically doubles in size around 2007, 2008. You get the foundation of the Oath Keepers. The Oath Keepers, not now, but for a long time, the Oath Keepers' sort of chief ideologue, as it were, was a guy who was a Vietnam vet who would invoke Report from Iron Mountain. You get a guy called Edward G. Griffin, who writes a book about the creature from Jekyll Island, about the Federal Reserve, and he's going to meetings with groups on the far right. And you look at his book, which was I think, if I recall correctly, endorsed by Rand Paul and others. this book has great detail in Report from Iron Mountain. Has one of the funniest mistakes in it. The whole thing about how he says that Iron Mountain is basically right next to Croton on Hudson, where the Hudson Institute's based. It's 80 miles distant. Doesn't take a long time to check, but because the sort of force of fictional neatness, he said, I suppose he says that's the case. So yeah, he really starts to revive, as I say, after the crash in Obama.
The people of January 6th also cite Iron Mountain?
I mean, I can't give you examples of people citing it on the day, but certainly the Oath Keepers were involved, and the Oath Keepers, as I say, have it in the background. The other place you can see it, or another place you can see it, more through Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, is here and there in QAnon, which obviously had a presence at Jan 6 as well, which is the point where Q says, in one of the Q drops, says the silent war continues. And I was watching this morning, actually, again, interview with Austrian TV that Jacob Angeli, the noted guy with the horns and the face paint, he plays such a kind of symbolically central role in that. He gave an interview, and I'm pretty certain it was before Jan 6, where he was talking about his whole grand thesis. He also has a big thesis about why Trump is actually a whistleblower against Epstein, which is why I was watching it again. But part of his whole thesis about, why the world state, the kind of central banks, this whole kind of massive tangled conspiracy he's got in his head, why that's happening, is all to do with underground bunkers. It's all to do with secret scientific experiments on cloning and stuff, which is being funded by central banks to enslave the public through debt, blah, blah, blah. And so that idea of the secret underground bunker, which is of course what Iron Mountain was in 1967, and why Leonard Lewin used the name, because it was so evocative, that's still sitting in people's minds as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was a connection they'd made.
Do you think that maybe Congressman Paulina Luna will have hearings on trying to find the source of Iron Mountain?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't put it past her. I mean, I think it was very striking, wasn't it, when she was put in charge of the task force on the Kennedy assassination, the first Kennedy assassination, the equation that seemed apparent from what she was saying publicly was, I believe there was more than one shooter. The files are about to come out. Ergo, the files will show that there was more than one shooter. And again, this sort of the logic is internally coherent in its own way, but doesn't make any sense either. So yeah, I mean, goodness knows, we shall see what she does next. But yeah, I can certainly see it landing in those quarters.
I mean, it's just I'm just flabbergasted by some of the stuff that she says, and she clearly doesn't understand the JFK assassination at all, and she just says all these ridiculous things. And God help us if there's more hearings on the JFK assassination. The last two set of hearings were just awful. Look, I'd like to get into this whole idea of truth. I mean, at the crux of your book is this whole idea of what is true, and the fact that we've sort of lost sight. We're all in our own little silos, and we all have our own individual truths, and we're losing sight of objective truth.
Yeah, and I think it brings together a bunch of different things in a way that is rather dispiriting, but I think we have to sort of pay attention to. You have the whole sort of process in the 1960s and 70s of in my degree is in English, and in the English literature schools, but also in other academic disciplines, the advent of critical theory and what then was called postmodernism. Now, there are some real utilities to that way of looking at things. It is a useful way to kind of problematize, defamiliarize things, and rethink. But the idea that all meaning is fundamentally subjective and that any meaning is basically imposed by a sort of dark authority, you can see how that could start to slide into something rather more difficult. At the same time, you have the rise of political figures like your current president, but certain people in Russia and people in various points across the world you don't need me to list, whose whole way of doing politics functions by effectively saying that things are true because I'm saying that they're true. And this plays into something that I think is often is a useful way to look at conspiracy theory, that conspiracy theory is kind of an escaped form of fiction. The kind of unity of narrative that you can achieve with great hard work as a fiction writer, you shouldn't try and achieve as a journalist or a historian or a politician, but that's sort of what they're doing. So no, there is a kind of, I mean, I think about Trump, I think Trump it's almost like somebody was saying to me this morning. I was doing an interview, and they were saying, he's saying that Jay Powell was the Fed was a Biden appointee. There's literally footage of Trump appointing him himself, but as he's saying that it's a Biden appointee, it sort of becomes true in his own head. I think there's that kind of logic about truth, and we have to be honest that there are other people who use phrases like my truth. If I recall correctly, Kamala Harris used it. I think we have to be very, very careful. There's a book that I mentioned briefly at the end of my book, a great book by a philosopher called Harry Frankfurt called On Bullshit, where he says we've moved from a kind of reverence for correctness and accuracy to a reverence for sincerity, which when Trump says these things, there's an argument that he is being, in the moment, is being sincere. Well, that doesn't help us very much. We need to get back to a sense that even if it's really awkward and difficult, we need to stick to the evidence.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, in my book, I was a teenage JFK conspiracy freak. I bring up just as an example of, did Assad use chemical weapons in Syria? And which he did, but you have people who immediately, well, that's not part of my narrative, and so what's amazing is all of a sudden websites will pop up, which no, he didn't use chemical weapons, and citing all sorts of people, and then other people who say that point to those websites. And then it becomes part of this. Well, you say your thing, I have my thing, and and we'll have to just sort of agree to disagree. But the truth becomes secondary.
No, exactly. And I think one of the real kind of moral tests of it's a very pompous phrase, but let's go with it. Moral tests of journalists and historians and so on is whether they're prepared to do it about their own most sacred, well, not quite their own most sacred beliefs, their own sides. Sacred beliefs. There's a journalist friend of mine here who's written a book on QAnon called James Ball, who, he is the political editor of our only kind of, about a newspaper which used to be called the New European. It's now called the New World, but it was literally founded as an anti-Brexit newspaper. He is the political editor thereof. But because he's also an investigative journalist, he has done sterling work unpicking the kind of coagulation of disparate theories into effectively a conspiracy theory around the idea that the reason that Brexit happened was manipulation by Cambridge Analytica, this kind of company that was scraping Facebook for data and then doing personality types, plus the Russians, plus aggregate IQ, plus etc. And that had been kind of assembled by Remainers who thought less critically into an explanation of Brexit, which was very consoling. James did the work of unpicking it, and he said to me when I interviewed him about it that what people think investigative journalists do is make connections between things. That's not what you do at all. Anyone can make connections between things. Your job is to kick the connections you really want to be true as hard as you possibly can and see which ones really stand up. I think if we had more of that, we'd be in a better place.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, one of the researchers I really like most on the JFK assassination is Paul Hoke. Paul Hoke was a conspiracy theorist in the 60s. Well, believed in a conspiracy, but over the years he's had to admit, look, I follow the evidence, and the evidence is leading me in the direction of no conspiracy. What can I do? It's just I have to admit it, and that's and of course now people really, really hate him for what he's saying.
Yeah, Edward Epstein, another example of that.
Yeah, exactly. Edward J. Epstein realized right up front there's something wrong with Jim Garrison. It's really this is horrible. But other people say, well, he's on our side. Can't, that's what's most important. He's one of us. And
exactly.
And so, anyway, so where do we go from here, and how do we fix some of this? Do you have any ideas on what we should do? Because your book is important, and there are real life ramifications to some of this.
Well, I mean, I went to a presentation of some polling after the US presidential election at the end of last year, which was conducted by an organization called PPI, which has roots in the kind of Clinton Democrat period, but it was conducted by two British people. It's conducted by a British pollster, effectively. But what it was saying was that when Democrats said during the election, and I saw signs of this when I was in Pennsylvania in the week before the vote, when Democrats said you have to vote Democrat to save democracy, right, and meant it sincerely, and there was a good case for it, and very impassioned, and all the rest of it. but said what voters often heard was, you have to vote Democrat to save my job and the status quo. Now, I think if you've got to the point where that's the case, I mean, as was indeed what unfolded, you have lost. You have to go back upstream from that. I mean, the way I think about conspiracy theories is that they're a kind of red flashing warning light on the dashboard of democracy. They're an indication that people feel, painfully disempowered. I mean, some people are obviously in a very particular sort of psychic place, and that's another matter. But in the general swing of things, given the amount of belief in this stuff, people feel very disempowered, and it's not hard to understand why. I mean, you look at people's sort of flatlining incomes since the financial crash. You look at all sorts of insecurity, particularly in the States around healthcare, for example. Look at the explosion of rage and pain after, the assassination of the guy from United Health, and people said some stuff that was very wrong, but the stories that were coming out were stories of humiliation and disempowerment. Now that is the sort of stuff that leads to conspiracy theory. So I think what we have to do is go significantly back upstream. I mean, I absolutely believe you have to try and distinguish between fact and fiction, but you can't just do that. You've got to make people's lives better. You've got to make people's lives good enough, cushioned enough, comfortable enough, just that they're not constantly looking for an explanation of why they've been wronged. And some of what drives people is going to be straight up racist, and we can't solve that way. But economically, we can, and I think that's where this points me to. And I've found my view of economic politics becoming a little bit more radical as a result of going through this process, because I cannot see another solution.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I'm actually a Canadian conservative.
Sure.
But what really bothers me is when I find people who, whether you're a conservative or not, will not ever challenge or criticize their own side. So, somebody on the conservative side says something ridiculous. Well, we can't say anything because he's one of us. And I think it's really, really dangerous. We have to have the freedom. And Canada's a really bad example. I mean, our parliamentary system, we have very rigid party rules about what you can say in Parliament. And so backbenchers of a ruling party, conservative or liberal, will never criticize their own party. If they do, there's severe ramifications of what will happen to you. And so you have mouthpieces. They just will say whatever the party tells them to say. And I think that's very, very, very dangerous, and makes me very, very upset.
No, I can see that. And I should say that, I think some of the most interesting economic radicalism that I have seen in response to this sort of thing has come from small c conservatives, both in this country and in the US. I will confess my knowledge of Canadian politics is not good enough to comment. Certainly not talking to somebody who's a scholar and present therein. But, I mean, in some ways, he's a very problematic figure. If you think about the whole sort of, fist on January the 6th, Senator Josh Hawley, I would not side with politically, on all of his positions, but it has been very striking to me the sort of righteous fury that he took into, for instance, his exchange with Mark Zuckerberg, or his exchange with the then CEO of Boeing, and the way that this person who in their organization and with their customer base had immense power, and Hawley saw it as his role to call that out in remarkably aggressive terms. You've seen, some very creative thinking in this country from Tories, sometimes actually more creative people on the left, because they've got a stronger sense of, having worked in business, of where business is pushing it a little bit, and it is, disempowering people. So, I mean, when I say that, I'm not taking a particularly partisan view.
Yeah,
I do think that
absolutely. I mean,
some creative
I
thinking.
really appreciate journalism. One of my favorite journalists in the UK is Nick Cohen.
Right.
I really, really like Nick because he's been very honest here. I'm on the left, but there's some problems with the left. But I'm still on the left, and so he becomes interesting because I can believe what he's writing.
That's a perfect example.
Yeah, and a sense of authenticity. Well, look, thank you very much for talking with me. Everybody, go out and buy this book, Ghosts of Iron Mountain. Buy it for yourself. Buy one for your friends. Or, it makes a great gift, and this book is very important, deserves to be widely read, widely distributed, and Phil, thank you very much for appearing with us.
That's very kind, thanks, I really enjoyed that.